welcome to The Witch in the Woods, and today I'm going to talk about the Celtic mysteries and the Druids. So just to clarify, I am not a member of the Order of Bards, Ovates and Druids, or the Bards, Ovates and Druids order. So that's the Obbods and the Bods. I am not a member of any of those, although like most people I have seen them about. So where I'm coming from, I was taught Druidry by a Celtic witch, and she came from a quieter line of Druidry, what I would call a sort of more discreet history of Druidry, and so I cannot claim to know the teachings of an official order of Druids. I just know what is Welsh tradition that's been passed along through family lines in Wales for centuries, and is quite well known to most Welsh people, I think. And I'm also going to mention the Irish tradition now. I'm going to apologise now that I cannot pronounce Irish. I do not for the life of me know why in Britain we were never told how to pronounce Irish words. There's a real taboo about speaking Irish or speaking any other kind of Celtic language, which is sad. So I apologise if I get any of the names wrong, which I undoubtedly will. So the islands of Britain have long been known as lands of magic and mystery, and perhaps the best well known of their folklore and their legends are the stories of Arthur. These stories talk of men who have magical powers and of women who are enchantresses. The Druids held much power in this land before the arrival of the Romans, and the Romans actually came to conquer the Druids and to mitigate their threat against the empire. And so it is that we know very little of the Druids today. They didn't write anything down. They kept a long tradition that went through sacred word of mouth. It was passed along from teacher to pupil, and it was memorised. And sadly, as the Druids died out, so did their knowledge and teachings. But the stories remained in the West, passed down by their descendants, the Bards and the storytellers, who spoke of myths of magic and of the Otherworlds. The Otherworlds of the Celts and the lands of the gods and the fairy beings were seen not as some kind of otherworldly place that could only be reached after death, but were in fact places that you could walk into, that you could stumble into, places that existed alongside our own mortal worlds. So stories go of how many people actually stumbled into fairyland, and of how the gods would actually pass from their world into ours as well. And these portals, these otherworldly entrances, could just be normal everyday places in the landscape through which you would inadvertently step from one world into another. And when the gods arrived, it was said that they could step into our world as though they were passing through a veil. When it comes to the Celtic mythology and fairy lore, there are so many aspects that I didn't know where to begin, so I'm going to begin with the creation myth of the Irish. And this is not so much a creation myth as the story of how the land came to be inhabited by successive waves of people. So in the Lebor Gabala Erenn, which is known in English as the Book of Invasions, which was written around the 11th century, there are recordings of 6 waves of invaders to come and inhabit Ireland, who were the ancestors of the current Irish people. So these 6 waves of invasion were first the invasion of Caesar, then the people of Partholon. Third, they were the people of Nemed. They were followed by the Firbolg, and then the people of Dana, or the Tuatha De Danann, as we call them today, and finally the Milesians. So the earliest account of this story was written by Nennius, attributed to Nennius, around about the 9th century. And he records a slightly more basic and more factual version, saying that Ireland was at first invaded by Iberians and then later settled by Gauls. Now, Geoffrey of Monmouth took Nennius's work as his basis of his History of the Kings of Britain. So many of these stories by the early writers have been dismissed as pure fiction, total fantasy and absolute bollocks, basically. But I am of the mind that oral history is never absolute bollocks. It may have been elaborated mythically, it may have gained elements, but somewhere in there may be some recording of history and tradition that has been passed on and maybe altered through time. So many of these stories speak of biblical things and invasion in terms of biblical stories. Many people are related to Noah, and obviously this was written in the 11th century and everybody was related to Noah in the 11th century. However, I do believe that there may be some element of factual information that we should not just dismiss, and that we should sometimes take their word for it. So it has been proved really through DNA that the Irish people do have a lot of Iberian DNA and probably did sail up the coast and settle Ireland from the Iberian Peninsula. It's also been proved just recently, or semi-proved, that the story in Geoffrey of Monmouth of Stonehenge being stolen from an existing circle in Ireland, which had its origins that sort of trace back to Africa. This may actually be semi-factual as well. There was a recent documentary on the BBC saying how they could possibly locate the location of the Bluestone Circle, which is one of the older areas of Stonehenge, to an existing circle in Wales, and that at that time that part of Wales was actually a province of Ireland. And so when Geoffrey of Monmouth saying it came from Ireland, he may actually have referred to Irish territory rather than the island of Ireland itself. So in my mind there may actually be some kind of grains of truth in many stories. Now, many of these mythical stories take us back to the classic literature and to biblical literature. But also I would like to argue that in my mind there is a slim possibility that, well, we know the Phoenicians arrived here and that there were trade routes from the Mediterranean up the west coast. They did come into Britain, they did come in to take the resources and the tin, and this was quite an old history. I mean, this happened a long time ago. And so the legends of Joseph of Arimathea, who apparently arrived on Louis Island in Cornwall and then came inland, that would seem to indicate that there was something going on with trade and merchant ships that regularly came to the southern coast of Britain. I'm not saying that we could prove any of this factually, obviously. So, back to the Book of Invasions. So after the biblical flood, the one that every mythology in the world says happened, the granddaughter of Noah, who we know as Kazar or Cesar, I'm going to say Kazar, and it's not Celt, it's Celt. So I'm going to say Kazar. She arrived in Ireland with 3 boatloads. They have travelled to the far northwest to avoid the flood, so this is before the flood, and they are sent to the northwest to avoid the ravages of the floods. And they arrive, and when they arrive there, some of their ships are sunk at sea, and as a result there are only 3 men and 50 women left. And so the men marry the women between them. So sadly this invasion was not too successful, and all of the invaders died except one man called Fintan. And it is said that it was Fintan who he changed into a salmon, and then into an eagle, and into a hawk. And in this fashion he survived for 5,500 years. And then he eventually changed back into a man so that he could recount the first story of the invasion of Ireland. So Celtic people had much reverence for animals, especially sacred totem animals. And amongst these were the eagle and the hawk, and also the salmon. Now it is told in the Mabinogion how they must find the child Mabon, the sacred child. And in order to find this sacred child, they have to ask the oldest of the animals. And the oldest of the animals is the salmon. So in terms of evolution, we may see that this is in fact plainly true. We evolved from the seas, and we evolved from aquatic life until it grew feet and crawled out onto the land. But why do the Druids call the salmon the oldest and wisest of the animals? Well, the origin of this tale is that a salmon will swim upstream back to its spawning grounds. It will swim against the flow of the river. It will even battle at waterfalls until it finds the very source of that river, which was the place where it was born. And this is the place where it will lay eggs for the next generation, so perpetuating this cycle of returning to the source of a river to begin the next generation. And so this story of how the salmon can find its way back to its birth and back to the source of a river is the reason why the salmon is the oldest and wisest of the animals, because it can return to the very beginning itself. So, back to the Book of Invasions. So we have left the story with Kazare, but the very beginning of this story, the very origins of this story, actually begin with 3 goddesses. And these goddesses are called Bamba, Fodla and Eire. Now, they come under the sail of Bamba and arrive in Ireland. And we can see that these are the triple goddesses in the form of the great ancestral mothers, or the goddesses of the land. So in this story, Bamba is married to McCool, which means a son of the hazel. Her sister Fodla is married to Mycecht, which means the son of the plough. And their sister Eire is married to Magrania, who is the son of the sun. So you may have heard the name McCool before, and you may have heard the story of Finn McCool. Now, this story goes that the wise old man Finnegas wanted to capture the salmon of knowledge, and the salmon of knowledge was reported to have eaten 9 nuts or hazelnuts that had fallen into the well of wisdom. And if you could catch this fish and eat it, then you would gain all the knowledge that the salmon of knowledge knew. And so he fished for 7 years trying to catch this fish. And one day, after 7 years, he caught the salmon and set about to cook it. Now he asked his nephew, I think it was, to cook the salmon for him, but on no account to eat any of it. Well, his nephew was Finn McCool, and he did as he was told and did not intend to eat any of the fish. But he cooked it, turning it over, and then as he touched it to see if it was cooked, a lump of hot fat jumped out and scalded his hand, and he sucked his finger to cool it, and instantly all the knowledge of that salmon was concentrated in that one drop of fat. And when Finnegas returned, he asked Finn whether he had eaten the salmon, to which Finn said he hadn't, but eventually he was found out. And so, admitting defeat, Finnegas gave him the rest of the fish to consume. And so it was Finn McCool, and not Finnegas the wise man, who had actually gained all the knowledge of the salmon of wisdom. So it was with all the wisdom of this salmon that Finn became the leader of the Fianna, who were the great notable hero warrior clan of the Irish. So the salmon and the hazelnut were linked in Druidic thought to wisdom and knowledge and inspiration, and the biting of the thumb for knowledge has parallels in many other Celtic stories too.
I went out to the hazelwood because a fire was in my head, and cut and peeled a hazel wand, and hooked a berry to a thread. And when white moths were on the wing, and moth-like stars were flickering out, I dropped the berry in a stream, and caught a little silver trout. When I had laid it on the floor, and went to blow the fire aflame, but something rustled on the floor, and someone called me by my name. It had become a glimmering girl, with apple blossom in her hair, who called me by my name and ran, and faded through the brightening air. Though I am old with wandering, through hollow hills and hilly lands, I will find out where she has gone, and kiss her lips and take her hands, and walk among long dappled grass, and pluck till time and times are done, the silver apples of the moon, the golden apples of the sun.
So some may see parallels in this story to the story of Taliesin, and it was said that this was the great initiation story of the Bards and of the Druidic caste. And in the story of Taliesin, the great dark goddess Ceridwen sets about to brew a potion that will heal her son. She has one beautiful daughter called Eire, but her son is dark and ugly and dim-witted, and he is called a Fagdu. And in order to grant a Fagdu some talent or some notability, she sets about to brew him a cauldron of inspiration so that he may become wise as a poet. And so she gathers together all her ingredients and she boils them for a year and a day. And during this year and a day she gets her servant boy Gwion back to stir the brew. At the end of this duration, a splash actually comes out of the cauldron and burns Gwion Bach's finger, and he puts it in his mouth to soothe the burning flesh. The rest of this tale goes through many transformations where he is pursued by an angry Ceridwen, and he changes into various animal forms while Ceridwen changes into his pursuer. And finally, Gwion Bach changes into a grain of wheat and hides himself amongst a whole batch of wheat, but Ceridwen turns herself into a black hen, and she pecks until she finds the grain that is Gwion Bach, and she swallows him whole. And in this way, in 9 months' time, Ceridwen actually gives birth to Gwion Bach again. Now this is a great initiatory story of the Druids, how the bard is born of the dark goddess. And because this time she has given birth to this babe, she doesn't have the heart to kill him now, but sends him downstream, where he is fished out of a weir by the son of a king who's kind of a hapless character, and he has many gambling debts and is a bit of a luckless individual, and he's hoping to find some treasure in the weir as he sees this bag bobbing downstream to pay off his gambling debts. But instead he opens the bag and out springs a babe, and from its mouth it is already speaking words of poetry and wisdom. And it says to Elfin, "Don't be sad, for the gift you've been given is far greater than you could ever realise." And so this is the birth of the great famous bard Taliesin, who is thought to have existed sometime around the 6th century. So these stories indicate how the potion that was meant for someone else is consumed haplessly by an innocent bystander, and instead they received the gift of wisdom and magic and the art of poetry. So this is a common theme for the gaining of wisdom that carries on in mythologies all across North Europe. And in many of these stories, the fish is actually replaced by a serpent. And we can see this in the story of Sigurd, who slays the serpent Fafnir. Now, Fafnir is also to be cooked for the king Regin, and it is Sigurd who actually tastes the serpent's flesh. And thus it is Sigurd and not Regin who gains the wisdom, and in this case it is the knowledge of the language of the birds. So stories tell how Finn could shapeshift too, and he could shapeshift into the salmon. Now this shapeshifting and taking on animal form is also part of the great Druidic tradition. And we can see this in the Song of Taliesin, where he's taken on many forms before the form he is now. We can also see this in the Song of Emergin, who was the leader of the Milesians.
Primary bard to Elfin am I, and my country is the region of the summer stars. Many have called me Merlin, but at length all men will call me Taliesin. I have been a herdsman and travelled over the earth. I have slept in 100 islands, guests of 100 kings. I have dwelt in 100 cities. For a year and a day I was in fetters. I have been a fierce bull and a yellow buck. I have been a boat upon the sea. I have been the foam of water. I have been a drop in the air. I have journeyed high as an eagle. I have been a tree stump in a shovel. I have been an axe in the hand. I have been a spotted snake upon a hill. I have been a wave breaking upon the beach. On a boundless sea I was set adrift. Then for 9 months I was little Gwion, in the womb of Ceridwen, and at length Taliesin. I have been at the throne of the distributor. I have stood high upon the white hill. I was fluent before being gifted with speech. I have been a teacher to all intelligences. I have singly built the tower of Nimrods. I am the Tetragrammaton. I am a wonder whose origin is not known. I shall be until the day of doom upon the earth, and it is not known whether my body is flesh or fish. Learned Druid, prophecy of Arthur, or is it me they celebrate?
Where Emergin tells of being many different forms before he took shape into the person he is now, including a stag of 7 tines and a salmon in a pool. This shape-shifting in different forms is said to have given Emergin leadership over all the land, and thus the ability to take the land from the Tuatha De Danann. These shape-shifting and animal motifs can be seen in many of the stories of the Celtic Otherworld, where travellers slip between one world and another, and it's as though they just stumble into fairyland. These stories tell us how these two mortal kingdoms exist side by side, parallel to one another. Stories exist of mortals entering into the otherworld and of gods walking from their worlds into ours. Very often in stories of the Mabinogion, this entering into another world occurs through the appearance of an animal such as a stag or a hunting dog. It is said that the dogs of Erenn were white hounds with pink ears. And Pwyth is said to have seen these dogs chasing them off a kill, and it is at this point in the story that he meets Erenn of the Otherworld. Now they change places for a year and a day, and through this exchange and of Pwyth entering into the land of Faerie, that he actually gains the hand in marriage of the goddess Rhiannon. So Rhiannon is linked to the horse and the mare, and these are symbols of the land goddess herself. And it is the land goddess, the horse, the mare, who actually has the power to bestow sovereignty upon the king. In many Celtic myths, the king is somehow wed to the mare, to the land, to the goddess herself, in order to gain the authority to be king of and leader of that land. In this story, Pwyth actually sees Rhiannon ride out of the mound herself, indicating to us that she is actually the goddess of the land. So going back to the first book of Invasions, we left the story at Kizea, and this was the first tribe of Ireland. Now this tribe would seem to represent the ancestral mothers, and it is said that Kizea arrived in Ireland with various women who were named Alba, Esper, German, Gotiam, Triage, and these are the ancestral mothers of all the people of the world, such as the British, the Germans, the Goths, and the Thracians, and the Spanish, of course. So in earlier legends, Bamba is the earth goddess, and she would seem to represent primordial forest. Her sister, Fodla, would seem to represent the agricultural and peaty and fertile land. And she is married to the son of the plough. And then their sister Eire would seem to represent the sovereignty and the goddess of the entire land itself. And so, in the first invasion of Ireland, what we are referring to here are the deep ancestral mothers of the Irish race. Now, Eire is the goddess of sovereignty, and the land of Ireland to this day is named after this goddess of Eire, or Eire, or Erin, as it's easier to say. And the story goes that Erin pleaded Emergin that the land would be named after her, Emergin being the leader of the Milesians, and he promised that this would be so. So the land was actually named after the three goddesses. So not only is the island of Ireland called Eire, but it is also poetically referred to as Fodla and Bamba, and in the way that we would call England Albion, one of its many names. And so the land itself is still named after these three matriarchal ancestral mother goddesses. So the second wave of invasion came through Partholon, and he was apparently a descender of Noah through Magog. And when they arrived in Ireland, Ireland was only open plain. And it was these people who introduced the plough to Ireland and agriculture. They also brought with them brewing and cooking. It was this tribe that divided Ireland into 4 quarters as we know it today. So in order to gain sovereignty over Ireland, the Partholons had to defeat the Fomorians. Now the Fomorians were a dark mythical race of underground dwelling beings. They are referred to in terms of caves and springs and dark places in the earth. They were somewhat rugged and rough and unrefined. They were seen as half men with goats' heads and massive giant beings. So the Fomorians represent the darker aspects of nature. So sadly all the people of Partholon died within 1 week of each other of the plague, and the only person to survive this was Tuatha De Danann. And like Fintan before him, Tuatha De Danann survived for several hundred years in different forms before returning as a man to tell the story of the second wave of invasion of Ireland. Now the dividing up of Ireland into 4 quarters makes Ireland a mythical and magical place. There is the north, east, south and the west, and we'll refer to these later. But these 4 quarters and later a 5th turn Ireland into a magical space. Today there are still only 4 provinces of Ireland, but the 5th is magically implied in that we might imply ether as a magical 5th element of the first 4 earth, air, fire and water elements. It's a shame that there isn't actually a 5th province of Ireland, and if there was, this would be around the area of Uisnech. And in this place is where Eire actually pleaded with Imogen to name the whole island of Ireland after her. So bear in mind that although there are 4 provinces, there is a 5th magical centre that sadly is not recognised today, which unites those 4 quarters, which maybe would be a good thing in Ireland. So the 3rd wave of invasion came from Nemed, and Nemed was also a descendant of Noah through Magog. And they arrive in Ireland, but they have a little bit of difficulty with the Fomorians. Now, they have to give tribute and sacrifice to the Fomorians every Samhain of 2/3 of their livestock, their wheat, and their children. Now this sacrifice to the Fomorians may actually recall some ancient practice of the sacrifice at Samhain. And at this time the livestock would be killed in a great sacrificial feast, so that they no longer needed to feed them through the cold of winter. So the Medians raise a great army of 60,000 warriors to defeat the Fomorians. And at first they do defeat them, but then the Fomorians fight back and they slaughter the Nemedians until only 30 are left. And it is said that these 30 left Ireland in 3 ships. Some of them went to the far reaches of the north. Some of them sailed to the land of Britain, where they became the ancestors of the British people. And some of them sailed away to Greece. So those that sailed away to Greece returned some generations later, and now they are called the Firbolg. Now the Firbolg mean the men of sacks, and this refers to the sacks that they have had to carry in Greece, as they were enslaved by the Greek people when they returned, and had to do menial work of carrying sacks of soil and clay around. So the Firbolg are referred to as dark, intellectually challenged and heavy people. They returned to Ireland with 5 leaders and divide Ireland up into 5 provinces. So they rule Ireland for the next 37 years. Meanwhile, those who had gone to the north of the world returned, and these people, who were also descendants of Nemed, are now the Tuatha De Danann, the people of the goddess Danu, or as the original meaning of their name was, the people of the gods. So the Tuatha, or the Tuatha De Danann, were seen as a supernatural race of mythical beings with amazing and astounding supernatural powers. These fairy beings were legendary, and respect for them still lives on in Ireland. The name was originally Tuatha, which meant tribe of gods. If I'm saying Tua right, I've heard many ways of saying Tuatha, Tuatha. I'm going to say Tua. The name was then changed to the tribe of Dana to differentiate themselves from the Israelites, who also started being called the Tuatha, or the children of God. And so now we know them as the Tuatha De Danann. They came to Ireland from 4 great cities, and these cities were Gorias, Phineas, Phalias and Murias. And they brought with them, shall I say that in right order? Phalias, Gorias, Phineas, Murias. So north, east, south and west. And they brought with them 4 great treasures, 4 magical treasures. And these were the Sword of Light, the Spear of Lugh, the Cauldron of the Dagda, and the Leofal. And the Leofal was the Stone of Destiny. Now the Leofal still resides on the hilltop of Tara, and it is on this hill that kings of ancient Ireland were crowned. The Leofal was a magical stone that was said to cry out in joy when a rightful king was crowned upon it. It was also said to roar in anger if a dishonest king or a false king would be crowned, and therefore it gave warning to the whole people of Ireland whether this was a worthy king or not. Now these legends of a stone declaring the right of kingship actually come down to us in stories of Arthur, where King Arthur can be the only one, the rightful king, to pull the sword from the stone. And so we see the sovereignty bestowed by a stone. And this is true, even our own monarch was crowned on a sacred stone. And this was the stone of Scone that came from Scotland. There's also the history of Scottish kings who would put their foot in a footprint on the stone at Duned in Argyll. And this was where they were crowned kings. It was said that the Tuatha De Danann brought with them great magical arts of science, art, architecture, and magical alchemy. They arrived in a dark cloud, and it was said that nobody knew when they arrived whether they were gods or men. This dark cloud may be some reference to them burning their ships so that they could not return to where they came from. The dark cloud was said to have covered the sun for 3 days and 3 nights, and from this magical land of the north they had brought back with them the arts of necromancy and magic. So the Tuatha De Danann represent the high spiritual beings. They are in contrast to the Fomorians, which are the dark chaotic forces of nature, and the Firbolg, which are the basest of mankind. The Firbolg, they lack intellect, they lack reasoning, they lack self-reflection. They are simply base human beings. The Fomorians are dark and greedy and destructive, and these are the worst aspects of base animal instinct. The Tuatha De Danann, however, represent the higher spiritual beings. They come from a higher astral realm, as it were, and they represent the gods as refined beings of light and wisdom and power. The Tuatha De Danann battle with the Firbolg and they win, but in this battle their leader Nuada loses a hand, and it is tradition amongst the Tuatha De Danann that their king must be physically perfect, and so he can no longer be the king of his people. Instead he is replaced by a Bress, and Bress is a beautiful man, but he is half Fomorian. And Bress is not a good king. He is greedy and he is not wise, and he raises the taxes to make it impossible for the Tuatha De Danann to exist. And so it is said that Nuada was crafted a silver hand by the divine physician Dian Cecht and the magical smith Credni. And with this silver hand, Nuada can therefore reclaim his kingship again. Now from this story we might discern that physical beauty and perfection are not always the wisest of attributes. The god Nuada is known in the Welsh as Nud or Nuth, and he is the father of Gwynap Nuth, the leader of the Wild Hunt and the lord of the Underworld. So Tuatha De Danann ruled for 150 years until the Milesians arrived, and it is said that when the Milesians arrived, their leader Emergin made a bargain or a treaty with them that they should share the land. But in this treaty, Emergin decided that everything above the land would be Milesian and everything below the land would belong to the Tuatha. And so it is in this treaty that Tuatha De Danann went quietly into the rocks and the mounds and the fairy hills and the trees and the springs and the rivers and the lakes. And so the Tuatha De Danann do actually still reside in islands, but they reside invisibly alongside the mortal race, the descendants of the Milesians. Now the Druids of Britain often boasted in many ways of not being made entirely of mortal flesh. So in the Cad Godot, Taliesin recounts of a poem that is undoubtedly older. No mother or father made me at all, substance and shape with the ninefold senses. They are springing from fruits, from the divine roots, from wild flowers, primroses, blossom of the hills, trees and shrubs. And I am of earthly clay on my birthday, and of nettle bloom, and the ninth waved foam. So this poem may remind us of the birth of Blodeuwedd, who is the fair flower face. And she is a woman who was not born of mortal kind, but actually created by the magician Gwydion to be the bride of a king. Now, poor Blodeuwedd cannot fulfill her role for which she was created, and so she goes her own way, and for this she is punished by being turned into an owl. An owl is a symbol of bad luck and bad omen. It is also a ghostly figure who roams the night alone when all of the other birds are sleeping. So too goes the story of Guinevere, whose name means white shadow, and she is also seen as a faithless and immoral woman. She is also the bride of a king, but as she betrays him, so the king's power begins to dwindle and fade. These fairy women may seem fickle and faithless, but they are not of the mortal world. They are of the fairy faith, and her face is much older. She is the ancient earth and death goddess. She is the owl goddess, an ancient goddess in her own right. Rhiannon marries the mortal man Pwyth, and so confers kingship upon Pwyth, who is Prince of Dyfed. But she is treated terribly. She is made to carry the burden of strangers and must confess to accusation and guilt which is not hers to bear. When these goddesses are made to suffer, they withdraw, and the kingship which they bestowed upon mortal men begins to suffer and fail. The moral here, now obscured, is that it is the fairy queen who bestows kingship, and they must be treated well, or the sovereignty of the land will begin to corrupt. It will lose its strength and power. So these are the origins of the fairy race and of mortal man, and these myths go deep into the heart of British lands. In these myths, humans and fairies dwell side by side, and entering into one realm or another is as easy as stepping through a cloud, or stepping between two stones or two trees. Often these fairy beings could be seen in the world too, as shadowy myths and ghosts of former ages and former beings. The magical land itself was a central part of Celtic and Druidic belief and mythology. Sacred places could bestow kingship. Wisdom was seen as poetry, inspiration and art, passed along not by powerful men, but by the whispered song of the smallest of birds. And time was an ever-turning spiral in the land that led right into the heart of the poet or bard. Well, that's it. Thank you for listening, and I hope you gained something from this. I would like to do some more videos on the more Welsh side of Celtic mythology. Let me know if there's anything you would particularly like to hear about. Thank you again for being here, and I hope to speak to you all again soon. If you liked what you did, please like and subscribe and hit buttons and ring bells and wear tin hats and whatever. Alright, cheers. Speak to you again soon. Bye. Help out a poet who wanted to receive the gift of wisdom and knowledge from the sacred salmon that had ate. So to eat this salmon was to gain the gift of knowledge and of inspiration. So Finn or Finnegal or Finn and Fionn. I'm going to try and tell the story. Finnegas. So Finn asked Fionn, or Finn McCool, he finally caught the fish. So Finn or Finnegas finally caught the fish of knowledge, and he wanted to cook this fish and then consume it. So he asked Finn McCool, or Fionn as we're going to call him now because it gets very confusing between Finn and Fionn. So he asked Fionn to cook the fish for him, but in no way to eat the fish at all. And he sucked it off his finger, and instead it was himself, Fionn, and not Finn, who gained the amazing gift of knowledge and wisdom from the salmon of knowledge. Now when Finn found out that Fionn had consumed some of the fish, he gave him the rest and conceded that he had not gained the gift, or that he'd been after for 7 years, and that it was actually Finn McCool's gift. That I told that story terribly. I'll try that again. There are many parallels between the stories of the Irish and Welsh mythologies, and I would like to go into more of the Welsh mythology later, but there is some telling in the Irish legends of the inhabiting of Ireland, so I began there. Oh, I'm going to do my Irish accent. Oh, I am. Oh, it's a lovely day. Top of the morning to you. Top of the morning. So long as you sound cheery, you can be Irish. Okay. the Tuatha De Danann ruled for 150 years. 150 years, that was Yorkshire. It was 150 years later, and the Malaysians arrived. The Malaysians arrived. So the Tuatha De Danann. The Tuatha De Danann ruled for 150 years, and the Malaysians arrived. And I've forgotten what I'm going to say next. In these myths, humans and where youth dwell. and where youth Fin and Fionn and Fionn and Fin and Fionn and Fionn. That's it. Thank you for listening. I don't know how to hate endings.